hi everybody. You can just give us 1 second here to get everyone to refresh their browsers and we'll get started. Thank you for your patience, as usual, getting these polar bear live chats running. It always seems to be something, but we have an awesome team here that just worked really hard for the last hour to get this going live. We have a pretty funny setup. We're going to take a picture and show you guys later what we're using to make this happen, but what matters is that it's happening. So with that, I guess we'll get officially started. So for those of you that may be joining us for the first time, welcome. This is the Polar Bear Live Chat with Polar Bears International. My name is Alysa McCall. I'm the Director of Conservation Outreach for PBI, and usually we're broadcasting live from a tundra buggy that's out a little bit outside of the town of Churchill, and we're driving around. We're in this mobile studio looking for bears and chatting to you from there. That's from Buggy 1, but today Buggy 1 is getting a little bit of buggy maintenance done, and so we are in downtown Churchill at the PBI house, which is on the main road here. And we're right next to Gypsy's restaurant, and we can see a lot of people walking by and tourists in the area, so it's kind of neat. And today we have a very special guest joining us, and so Jack, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Jack Omelak. I've been here in Churchill for 4 or 5 days maybe. Originally born and raised in northern Alaska. Now live in Anchorage, so many of you probably know where that's at. And here to talk about polar bear management. That's some of what I do. But probably, from what I understand, we're also going to be talking a little bit about walrus today.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jack. We sure appreciate having your perspective. I think a lot of us watching, including myself, we definitely don't live anywhere near the subarctic or Arctic regions, and having someone born and raised and who's involved in the management of marine mammals in the Arctic in your daily life is a pretty interesting perspective. First of all, before we get into the animals, can you tell us just a bit about what it was like growing up in Alaska, why that might be different than someone who grew up in Montana, for example?
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to see where, our audience is from, so I know who I'm speaking to, but, I was very fortunate growing up the way I did. We always hear about, people think they're the last generation that lived this way and all of that, and that's going to continue to happen. I was born in '71, which really isn't that long ago. But as I said, I was very fortunate. There were a lot of social changes taking place around that time. You have to remember oil was discovered in 1969. Land claims up there was settled in '71. And then you had sort of the last great gold rush after oil came on the market, and then you had a drastic increase in population in Alaska, and those sorts of things. And I was pretty fortunate that my mother, she spent most of her life living simply out in the country, moving from one spot to another, chasing resources. And so in the springtime, meaning May, the end of May or June, it was out into the mountains. We'd usually walk. We didn't have a car. We'd go out to the mountains and spend about 3 weeks trapping squirrels. And the reason why we did that in the springtime is because their coats were nice. They weren't tattered from fighting with other squirrels. They've basically been hibernating all winter long, so the Eskimos up there, they like the really pretty, just emerging from their hibernation coats. They also had a little bit of white in them, and if you waited for the end of the season, they didn't necessarily have that pretty white color in their fur. So that was one of the first things I did, and then of course we'd wait around for fish and those sorts of things. But that was a little bit of my childhood. I was very fortunate because, as I said, my mother was one of the very few people that made sure her kids did that, lived that lifestyle. And the people who are my age, my friends that I grew up with, the only way they got to experience that is if they were with us. So I spent a lot of time growing up in a canvas tent out in the country.
Wow, and that's probably very different than a lot of our viewers. One point you made often this week, Jack, when we were doing our educational outreach programming with the kids, is that there really isn't the access to grocery stores guaranteed in a lot of northern communities.
To market. So, you know, there are a few stores, usually one in each village. Sometimes they're in people's houses, that type of thing. And when you think about the cost of shipping, meaning you can't just truck something in, it's got to be flown in through a major air carrier to a hub and then transferred to sort of a regional carrier. I was just in one of the villages a couple of months ago shooting some footage, and one of the kids took a picture of a 10-pound bag of sugar, and not including tax, that 10-pound bag of sugar was over $20. So yeah, there are stores, but it's the prices there are difficult. So there is a big reliance on going out, whether it be the ocean or inland, freshwater, and really filling your freezers up during whatever season you're in. So I think another thing to think about is because of the climate and the short growing season, there are very few, medium, well, there aren't any medium or large scale agriculture, and very few sort of personal gardens. So I remember reading a study by the state of Alaska a few years ago, and it was about 73% of rural Alaska's caloric intake, meaning what they eat, protein and vegetables, 73% of that came from local resources, meaning what we call subsistence.
That's amazing. That's a huge percentage. And for much of that, subsistence hunting is done during the winter using the sea ice to get access to different prey species. Can you talk a little bit about using the sea ice and maybe how the sea ice has changed your access to different food sources over the years?
Yeah, well, sea ice is very significant. Alysa was asking me to tell a story about one of the things we used to do when I was growing up. So I was named after a pretty famous man. His name was Happy Jack. And you have, if you're interested, there were a lot of cultural taboos when it came to hunting in the wintertime. And the life of the northern Eskimo is pretty fascinating if you could sort of claw through some of these generalized understandings of indigenous people, and do some research about what things were like before 50 or even 100 years ago. Pretty fascinating. I began my career in social science and anthropology, so they had many taboos for going out and hunting in the wintertime in the Seward Peninsula area that I'm from. And if you want to pull up a map, Seward Peninsula lies right there in between the Bering Straits, of course, between the U.S. and Russia. And so my mother's, half of my mother's side came from a place called Little Diomede, and then the other half and my father's side came from a place called White Mountain. And so one of my grandfathers was a famous man, and he sort of got the reputation because he got trapped on an ice floe for about 4 months, and they ended up having to cut his feet off. That was around 1902 or 1903. basically worthless to the small community if you couldn't provide. And so what he ended up doing was he ended up being the first person that was credited for developing the commercial ivory carving that Alaska is known for. So, you know, after harvesting walrus or things like that, you take the ivory and make not artifacts, but art out of them. And he was credited with being the first one to do that. So sea ice is just a significant part of our history. And recently, you know, we've been seeing changes because not only the loss of what's called sea ice extent and duration, meaning how far south the sea ice permeates and then how long it sticks around during the summer months. That's what I understand is sea ice extent and duration. Those changes are being noticed by the coastal villages that depend on marine resources to provide them food. And so one of the examples is that not is it that just the sea ice has diminished and the extent has decreased, but we also have changes in wind patterns and ocean currents. So these villages that were sort of established, you know, around 1900, you have to remember that much of rural Alaska, the natives did not have permanent settlements because things were changing all the time and they just picked up and moved. And so when sort of the government of Alaska started to step in, they demanded in the 1930s that these native populations settle into permanent settlements. So what I'm getting at is you have permanent settlements now, whereas you used to be able to be mobile, and these permanent settlements with shifting in sea ice patterns, wind, and current, the sea ice is drifting off and ending up in places where it historically hasn't been. And so when, you know, just 20 years ago, you'd have to go 20 miles, maybe 15 miles to access your marine resource, walrus, polar bear, seal. And within, you know, the last decade, it's, I heard reports earlier this summer, villages are sometimes having to travel up to 100 miles one way.
That's really amazing. You related this week the sea ice and the animals there. It's kind of like your garden up there.
Yeah, so, you know, there's a few buzzwords that you'll hear coming out of Alaska and conservation. Subsistence was one of those. Climate change is another. Food security is another. And now you're starting to hear that the ocean is our garden. And that is true. I was just on St. Lawrence Island, for those of you who want to look at where that's at, in the community of Savunga. And I had grown up in the region my entire life. And I was there, just happened to be at the right time. I think it was about 2.5 months ago now. And the community kept telling me about that everybody was going down to the beach to harvest sea peaches. And so I had never seen one, but later that night I went to dinner and had one, and I had never thought anything could ever be so sweet and tart, but look the way it did. So it's, you know, you think about not just protein that you get from the ocean, and that being called our garden, because as I said before, there's no medium or large scale agriculture, but it is where a majority of the people collect their food from on a daily basis.
Right. And I found it interesting. We were looking at the explore.org Walrus Cam the other day. That's one of our favorites for sure. And you had a different reaction than a lot of us. You said it actually made you hungry.
Yeah, it looked pretty tasty when I was looking at the Walrus Cam. So walrus are an even much more important species for what we call subsistence, meaning the ability to feed yourself, than polar bears. If you think about the smaller number of the worldwide polar bear population, or even distinct populations, they're relatively small. And walrus, in comparison, the population numbers are much greater, much more accessible. They are a very, very important food source. And so when you have a spring or a fall migration of walrus, that's when the communities really load up on this food. You also have communities that harvest whales. And so if you can imagine a 60-foot whale being landed in a community of 300 people, that's a lot of food. It's very difficult, though, to land one of these whales, and you also supplement your food intake with these walrus. So one of the neat things about walrus, and I told this story the other day, is if you harvest a walrus, they use the sea ice to stage to do their feeding as well. So this mass of floating sea ice is rich biodiversity, but it's also habitat for many of the foundations of what we call the food web or the food chain. And so walrus use it as well. Just like polar bears, they can't expend all that energy swimming in the ocean all the time. So they lay on these large, what's called ice floes, that generally hang around in shallower water, and that's where they stage and feed. So they dive down underneath and use their tusks to dig around and eat clams and mussels and those sorts of things. So one of the sort of bonuses when you harvest the walrus is they call it imonuk, and one of the things you get to do is you get to eat the clam, whatever the walrus has eaten that's inside the stomach, and you could eat them raw because they've basically been cooked by the internal juices of the stomach, and it's quite a treat.
That is pretty cool. Kind of in that same vein, we do have a question. Someone is curious about polar bears, seals, and walruses. For those food sources, what are those different animals used for, or what are the main parts that you use from different animals, those three, or eat, or are there specific things you're looking for in each of those? And maybe in walrus, it's the clams in the stomach.
Yeah, you're not necessarily, looking for something specific out of those, because you often hear that, for the most part, Native people use the entire resource. And so it's more about the timing within the year. It's not necessarily that everything is going to be accessible to you, so you take whatever you can during that time of year. But in regards to polar bears, one of the things that's shifting when compared with 50, 75 years ago is that people are sort of, their, desire to take polar bears is sort of been decreasing for a couple of reasons. One, polar bears handling the internal organs is, people don't like to do that because their concentration within the liver, vitamin A, literally turns people's skin white if you touch it. And so they don't like to handle the internal organs because their hair and their skin will turn white, and they're afraid of that. And, but they still eat polar bear when they're sort of around and easy to take. The other part of it is it takes so many days and so many hours to properly process that hide. So if you think about it, that used to be a community event. You'd have 3 or 4 women that would spend a day or so processing this hide and turning it into valuable clothing. So if you think about the time and effort it takes to do that, when it's much easier to just go and buy warm clothing, that sort of led to a reduction. But quite frankly, you know, how many people want to spend you know, that kind of time on the ice, out in the cold, cutting that bear up for food? Now, it still happens, but when you have other resources out there, such as whales or walrus, which, you know, you're not just talking about a single animal, but hundreds at times, the efforts go into that. So we see what we're calling sort of this organic reduction in polar bear harvests.
That's really interesting. We have another question. So someone is wondering about the changes, and you kind of have touched on this already, the changes that Arctic communities have made to address climate change. So what have you had to do? And you may want to touch on what you've been told to do to address climate change. And then what would you want to see the rest of the world do to help you out, who are, your families are kind of on the forefront of this change?
So you might have to remind me, because it sounds like there's a couple of questions
Sorry, yeah.
there. Yeah. So what have Arctic communities done to prepare themselves or adapt to climate change is one of the questions I think I heard.
That's a, yeah, good way to frame it.
It's been very difficult because, quite frankly, they haven't caught up yet. And so I want to be careful about how I say this, but our Arctic communities have been talking about the effects of climate change for decades now. And it really hasn't gained much traction until it became sort of a global issue. And what we've been saying for decades is our resources are moving farther and farther away. It's taking us longer to get there. And we haven't necessarily been concerned with reduction in population. It's access to the resources, meaning they're going to different places. So I've been a part of some of the Arctic Council, which is you know, the group of Arctic nations that get together and meet. The U.S. is chair of the Arctic Council, I think, for the next 2 years. And one of the things that they proposed is, in order to make our Arctic communities more adaptive and resilient, you know, they've proposed this idea of setting aside or trying to come up with something like a $500 million starter fund or something similar to that. And one of the things that I've been pushing for, not just in international and domestic negotiations, but in authoring or being a contributor to some of these reports, is that we have sort of this pressure by the global community for a small number of indigenous people who are basically feeding themselves to stop doing that. And so one of the things I've been arguing is that we need to preserve sort of the things that have allowed Native people to be adaptive and resilient for the last, you know, several hundred, perhaps even thousands of years. And increased regulation and legislation won't necessarily help that. I'm doing on behalf of our communities. But you have to remember that the communities haven't caught up to the radical social, cultural, and economic changes that happened 50 years ago. So if you're asking what are communities doing, they're doing relatively little. And so one of the things I like to point out is at times on behalf of our federal government, I'm in the communities soliciting information on how to manage polar bear populations. And so the last time I was in one of the communities, that's what I was there to talk about. In the community, the first question they asked me was, why should we be talking about managing polar bears right now when we have diesel fuel in our drinking water? So that's an example of what I mean when we're still sort of catching up to issues that happened 50 years ago.
Right. I think it can be, it can seem easy for us down south here to talk about conservation and what needs to happen, but when there's people living with diesel in their water, and for us to be asking for a Band-Aid solution to climate change, which is a global issue that all of us are a part of, it's not really fair to these communities. And you had a great line about those who have the least to offer are being asked to sacrifice the most in a lot of these cases in northern communities. So I think that's so powerful to hear that perspective. Thanks for sharing that, Jack.
Yeah, a lot of that comes from, what ideologies, I think, and I sort of pride myself on making out of the community I grew up in. I really value a formal education, and one of the things that my mentors taught me was to think, speak, read and write critically. And so what I'm talking about here is, I guess, the emerging ideology concerning climate change. And yes, we all agree that we should work towards conservation, environmental justice, and these sorts of things. But too often at times, you have what's called, the outsider perspective that wants sort of tangible results when it comes to offsetting or mitigating climate change, but often at the expense of the people who really have the least to offer. As Alysa said, that too often they're sacrificing the most. And what I'm talking about is, at least in regards to polar bears, and I see it happening very quickly with walrus and seals, is that our country's inability, both domestically and internationally, to sort of negotiate offsetting or reducing, the primary driver or threat of climate change, which is global carbon emissions. They readily admit that their ability to address those, is very limited. So by default, limiting a small number or a small representative of people that depend on harvesting these resources through subsistence are the first ones to be asked to give up their lifestyle, meaning stop hunting polar bears, walrus, seal, and those sort of things.
Mm-hmm. And that ties into a couple related questions that we've come in. If you could ask the people of the more southern states or Canada, or how can we help your communities, or what can we do for you? How can we work better with these northern communities for positive outcomes?
Well, there's a lot of things. Something as simple as turning a very simple, and I just don't think that people understand the cumulative effect of that. But I guess come up with these sort of simplified understandings of ecosystems, and including, the human aspect. Unless we have sort of this broader and at times more detailed understanding of affect others and things like that, then I think we can all work towards bringing in line sort of, I don't know, what pessimists would call a utopian approach to conservation. And so I guess just educating yourself on some of the issues. And that's probably the most important thing, at least for today, that I can identify. Understand, one of the things I believe you were there also, Alysa, we just had a polar bear stakeholder meeting in West Virginia. And there is this, divide that exists. It's a perceived divide between the conservation or animal rights community and, the people or the indigenous people that live off these resources. It's sort of a difficult thing to understand or even accept. And if you look at the relationship between Polar Bears International and the groups or the agency that I represent, on one hand, we say we're working towards conservation of the species, but how can you continue to allow people to shoot polar bears? It's a difficult thing for most people to process. But you have to remember that, it isn't the small annual removal of polar bears by native people who are feeding themselves. That isn't the primary threat to the population. And so one of the things we had to settle on at this meeting in West Virginia is that, most indigenous people and groups, we have sort of the same goal for the species that we rely on, that we will be able to continue to use these resources and appreciate them long into the future. Because quite frankly, if we overharvest or use them in a way that isn't right, they're going to go away very quickly. And that's a very much different scenario from the type of relationships that you hear with other indigenous groups. I did a lot of my work in Kansas and Oklahoma. I spent a lot of time there. And yes, there's reverence for the animals, but when you think about the fact that many of those populations have been displaced, they don't have that physical relationship to the land. And so we're talking about not just revering the animals, but they provide us with a majority of our food, and we can't let that resource go away. And so I think that helps us, that understanding brings us closer in line with what conservation and animal rights groups are trying to accomplish as well.
I totally agree. And that really fits in with Explore.org's mantra of never stop learning. I just really appreciate your perspective on that. That's just, I think, so important for a lot of us to hear. On maybe a slightly lighter note, someone wants to follow up on, you were talking about handling the organs, or people not wanting to handle the polar bear organs. Can those be eaten by other animals, or are they left out on the ice, or do you just dispose of them if they're just so dangerous to touch for humans?
Yeah, I'm sure they're eaten by other animals, and they're usually left on the ice.
Yeah.
And so I'll just give you an example of sort of some of the, the lines that I sort of have to tap dance in between. We're working with our federal partners. The Nanuuq Commission, which I oversee, also oversees 2 treaties, one between the U.S. and Russia and one between the U.S. and Canada on polar bears. Of course, we have other partners that help us. But essentially, the reason why the Nanuuq Commission exists is our federal government declared that the Alaska Nanuuq Commission would be a full partner in the management of the U.S. polar bear populations. And as a result, we're named in the 2 treaties as well. And what that means is that we're a full partner to our federal managers in managing polar bear populations. So if you think about it, we had great Senator Ted Stevens, who passed away in the last few years, and he was a champion for Native people of Alaska having a significant part and role in the managing of their resources. So we had realized that we had made some mistakes in dealing with the Native people in the lower 48, and they tried to do things a little differently in Alaska. So this idea of co-management came along. And so that gives the Alaska Nanuuq Commission and myself authority to develop regulation policies both domestically and internationally. So it's a very fine line when you're talking about appeasing sort of a global community, but also advocating for the continued use of your resources. One of the things that is being proposed by our federal partners is that, and we know that accurate and timely reporting about harvest helps us better understand population trends and those things, much like the robust reporting and oversight here in the Canadian harvest. One of the things that has been proposed is that we provide tissue samples for those organ type things. Now, how do you sort of come to some mutually beneficial way of reporting when federal managers want natives to handle the organs, but the Native people don't necessarily want to do that? So when I talk about understanding the intricacies or the details of a very complex issue, that's an example of sort of what I'm talking about. I mean, it's very easy to say we want increased biological sampling, but then getting people who live and interact with these things on a daily basis, getting them to do something they don't want to do is difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In that vein, and maybe people have found this out through sampling that has been done, is there any concern in the communities about increasing levels of mercury or toxins in the marine mammals?
Well, of course there is. And I don't know how many of our viewers or participants are from the U.S., but I'll just provide you an example of sort of interagency, domestic and international collaboration or integration of understanding is very, very difficult. It doesn't make sense to the common user of these resources that you have one agency, polar bears, which is overseen by the Department of Interior, and then you have their main prey, which is seals, which comes under the Department of Commerce. And so how much integration or lack of integration affects, our concerns or our needs. So this issue of contaminants is, as you know, polar bears sort of being the apex predator, biomagnification. These sorts of things are important. A couple of years ago, we had a small sample of the population that was coming down with open sores, and a lot of the coastal villages were concerned because it was about a year after the Fukushima effect, the meltdown in Japan. And so us resource managers under the Department of Interior were concerned. Of course, so were the seal and walrus people. Walrus come under Department of Interior as well. But then you have these what were called unusual mortality events. And then seals started showing up with lesions and sores on the inside. And so us resource managers within the Department of Interior only had so much ability to influence the State Department and the Department of Commerce to find out, or at least begin to work on identifying some of these issues. So we're concerned about it. But if you sort of roll all of those problems in, along with the lack of funding, and then sort of this understanding that, a small percentage of Native people are pretty far down the totem pole when it comes to addressing their issues or concerns, it makes it pretty tough for us.
No kidding. And that's really something that's important to remember. As a global community, we're more interconnected these days than ever before, and just having a better understanding of what other communities are going through and how our actions can impact that, I think is really important. And if maybe getting back to sea ice, with the changes in sea ice, and that's really what Polar Bears International is focusing on. It's the bigger picture, climate change, the sea ice, preserving the sea ice into the future to make sure that we have polar bears for future generations. That's our key goal. But with that, if the food sources do shift up where you are, if the sea ice continues to shift, causing some of your food sources to shift, are there any potential new food sources being identified? Someone wants to know, do you have any idea if other things are going to move up into your community? But of course there's the cultural knowledge of, you know, shifting what you're hunting, and that's kind of a big thing.
Yeah, and thanks for the question, because I try not to be a pessimist, because obviously humans have been around for a long time because of their ability to adapt, not just to new habitats but new food sources. But one of the things you have to remember, it's at the rate of change that's happening that's making it difficult. So if you want to think about things in a much larger perspective, at least within the state of Alaska, you have multiple bodies or agencies that basically manage or control either land or access to resources. So you have the federal government and then the state government that divide up marine resources. The state has a majority of the land, fresh water, and then you've got local villages, and then you've got cities, and then on top of that you have tribal entities, and then you have regional profit entities and regional nonprofit entities. So if you think about how difficult it is, you can't just sort of walk out your door and not have an understanding of who owns what and who manages what. And one of the jokes I've been hearing from a guy named Jimmy Stotts, who some of you may know at ICC, but he's saying nowadays when a hunter goes out, he's got to bring his lawyer with him. A little funny. So what does this mean when we're talking about access to new resources? So I just heard a presentation a couple months ago from a lady who has spent considerable time in rural Alaska, and that was what she was proposing, was about access to new resources, but not just access to new resources, but how to preserve them, and the seasonality of those things. But from what I understand is we don't necessarily have the best idea of what's to come. And I was just reading an article in one of the papers the other day about the variability of berries. So berries is also, the 3 or 4 types is a very significant sort of staple of rural Alaska. And in my short lifetime, the variability on those things is incredible. And perhaps there's a little bit of romanticism, but I don't ever remember having to worry about not getting at least one of the species of berries, in abundance. And the last few years it's been difficult, either too wet or too dry. So those things are there, and one of the things I want to talk about in regards to walrus, I was just in St. Lawrence Island, both in Savunga and Gamble. And we work with what's called the Eskimo Walrus Commission. They're a co-management agency like the Alaska Nanuuq Commission. And as I said, walrus are a much more important subsistence staple. And for the last 3 years, and it's not because of the decline in the population of the Pacific walrus, as I said, it's access to the resource. So these communities are having to travel by boat, up to 100 miles. if you think about the cost of fuel, sometimes $7 to $9 a gallon, that 200-mile trip is very significant. But they'll do it because it's the only way to feed themselves. So what I'm getting at is typically these two communities would harvest 600 to 700 walrus a year. And when I was there just a couple of months ago, they were writing a disaster declaration to the state of Alaska, although it's a federally managed resource, to declare a state of emergency because the communities between the two only harvested 20 walrus. So the one thing we emphasized was a population decrease that resulted in the small harvest that was having to get all the way over there to get them. And so a couple of the things that the state of Alaska was proposing, and to some extent they flew in about 400 pounds of halibut to the community. That was one approach they took, but that's just a temporary approach. One of the other things that they're looking at is making reindeer herds, which are pretty plentiful in the Seward Peninsula, bringing them to a local market. The problem is you have to fulfill all these Food and Drug Administration demands to serve the people that need it, and with all of those sort of things you have to satisfy, then the cost of bringing reindeer to market about as much as beef when it comes down to it.
Wow. Wow. Pretty interesting food security issues going on up there. That's maybe we'll just end with one last question then. What is your greatest hope for these Alaskan communities? Or what do you see happening in the future in an optimistic world, and how do we get there?
Well, I think my passion really lies, although I work with polar bears and other marine resources, my passion lies in providing opportunity for our local children. It was a very, very tough life to grow up in, and it's very unfortunate that a lot of these kids who are bright and capable, they're just apathetic about their future, and meaning that there isn't a whole lot of opportunity and economic opportunity. So the problems that sort of the loss of access to the resource will create soon is going to be pretty tough to deal with. One of the communities just 2 weeks ago, in a community of about 300, had 4 suicides in less than 10 days, and they were all teenage kids. So, you know, with this whole idea of conservation and global environmentalism and all of that, it's fine to think about, but what I'm really concerned or passionate about is providing some hope and opportunity for these children out in these communities that deserve, not just deserve, but are willing to work towards something. So I'm all for education. I'm all for being in school, staying in school, and then working towards formal education after high school. So what I hope to do through polar bear conservation is provide internship opportunities because, you know, pretty soon we're going to need a new generation of leaders, and I don't think enough is being done to prepare that younger generation, so that's what I hope.
Well, thank you, Jack. We sure appreciate you talking to us today. I think you taught a lot of us some new, really important things, and let's not forget to keep people in mind when we're talking about conservation, because you really can't take people out of these ecosystems that we're changing. We are all a part of it. And thank you for everything you are doing to reduce your carbon footprint, to keep polar bears around, to keep people around living their lifestyles in the Arctic, and to keep sea ice around for a very long time. So we are going to continue with our live chats next week. Meanwhile, we will be working on Buggy 1 and running the polar bear cams as often as possible. We'll also be answering your questions. And thank you to explore.org as usual for allowing this all to happen. They're our wonderful partner. Thank you to Parks Canada for helping us with those polar bear cams out at the Cape there. They're awesome. There's some really cool activity out there where there's no humans right now. We also want to thank the CNSC for their assistance with the Northern Lights cam, on which there was a gyrfalcon this morning, which was very cool. We're always on the lookout for those. Those aren't very common up here. And also thanks to Frontiers North Adventures, of course, for lending us Buggy 1 and doing all sorts of amazing stuff with us and helping us out and putting the cams on their Tundra Buggy Lodge. So thanks to all the viewers. Never stop learning. Thanks again, Jack. It was really great having you this week. We loved having you up here. I could listen to Jack talk for hours on end. But we've got to wrap up, so have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.